Latin America and the End of the Washington Consensus, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage, Assistant Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. The current economic crisis shaking the world's financial capitals has prompted some Latin American leaders to call for an end to Washington's economic policy prescriptions. Brazilian President Lula da Silva warned that the region's emerging economies would not become, quote, victims of the casino that the bankers set up in the United States. Bolivia's Evo Morales blamed the crisis on North American privatization policies, while Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez went further, placing responsibility on what he termed an unsustainable capitalist system. Across Latin America, recent elections have brought to power governments highly skeptical of the set of policy prescriptions known as the Washington Consensus. With a review of recent Latin American economic history and a look at what might lie ahead, we're joined in the studio by Dave Ranney, Professor Emeritus in the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Professor Ranney helped found the Hemispheric Social Alliance, a coalition of trade unions, environmental and human rights organizations, and others promoting an alternative to the free trade model. Professor Ranney, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I know you've been in the region very recently and have some sort of ground-level observations to make. But before we get to that, I'm wondering if you could give us a little background on this notion of the Washington Consensus. What was it? What kind of policies did it advocate?
This was really a new strategy for capitalism in the world, really, but based in the United States, to have a high degree of capital mobility, to open up the economies of other countries for manufacturing activity and even services that were previously in the United States. And they accomplished that by softening up the economies, often as a quid pro quo for loans from the International Monetary Fund, where they would do what they called structural adjustment programs. That was changing their production to goods for export, cutting down government expenditures, balancing budgets, privatizing everything in sight, and most importantly, taking away all restrictions on the flow of money in and out of the country.
So very much a free market approach.
That's correct.
And what were the economic problems it was designed to address?
Well, essentially a lack of markets for U.S. goods. That was the main thing. What eventually happened, however, is that the financing to do this gave the finance sector of our economy a great deal of more clout and power, so that money began to flow. And that debt in and of itself became a commodity and became probably the primary commodity in all of this.
So where was this applied most rigorously in the region?
Well, it was applied initially in Mexico and Canada through the North American Free Trade Agreement, and then throughout Latin America, notably countries like Argentina and definitely Bolivia, where I just was, through the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund provided what they called bridge loans for countries that were having problems repaying their debt. And as a quid pro quo for those bridge loans, and also with the implicit threat that if they didn't go along with this, that they would not get any foreign money at all, they had to essentially alter their economic policies to adapt to this new system.
So what was the system that obtained throughout the region before these were put in place? I mean, we hear a lot about sort of the populism of the 80s.
Yeah.
And
well, there had been what was very popular, particularly in South America and well, really all of Latin America, was what they called import substitution. That they were putting high tariffs on foreign goods and attempting to develop their own capacity to produce goods for export.
So along comes the Washington Consensus, which to a greater or lesser degree gets buy-in by many, if not most, of the governments of the region. So over the longer term, what was the effect on the ground?
Well, it was very poor. In Bolivia, for instance, they essentially privatized the mines, they privatized water, they privatized gas and oil, and the mines eventually were closed and threw hundreds of thousands of people out of work. It's been preceded by very tight monetary policies, so people were already hurting, and there was a tremendous migration inside of Bolivia. And the end effect was it redistributed income upward, so made the rich even richer and the poor even poorer, essentially. And that was, now in Argentina, there was a tremendous economic collapse as a result of these policies. So that in country after country, poverty really increased. There was a small class that got richer, and they were the ones that were in political power at the time. Mexico is a little more complicated, but I think the net result, for instance, of NAFTA, and really that started with IMF-imposed policies, NAFTA followed that, has been, again, a tremendous amount of unemployment. People who had initially engaged in subsistence farming were essentially tossed off the land as a result of those policies and forced to work in factories at the border, which they called maquiladoras. But there has been in Mexico a tremendous redistribution of income.
So what would be the response to an IMF spokesperson who would say, but look at the fundamentals, inflation was wildly out of control before these policies were put in place, and now we've tamed that?
The question always was, and this is what we raised in the Hemispheric Social Alliance, there was this assumption that there's only one way to do things, or two ways to do things, the wrong way and the Washington Consensus way. And we argued that there are many routes to go, some of which are being tried out in South America right now. We can talk about that later. But they said that yes, and it was true, inflation came down in a country like Bolivia. Inflation came down in Mexico, but at the expense of unemployment, where people were actually starving. The argument is that this is more efficient, and in the long run, having this wealthy class of people would trickle down. I mean, they made this argument within the United States, right? That would trickle down, and everybody would be better off. And there's still some diehards that believe that.
Well, so these policies were put in place for good or ill, and eventually there was a certain political backlash, so that in the last several years we've seen in country after country sort of left-to-center governments coming in that really ran on a platform of repudiating a lot of this. So to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I think Argentina was one of the early shots across the bow, because Argentina had had such a terrible economic collapse. They eventually said they wouldn't pay off their debts, and they said they wouldn't accept IMF policies. And when that happened, the IMF and all of the other foreign financial institutions, the international financial institutions, as well as other governments that had lent money, pulled all their money out of Argentina. Argentina has been able, however, to survive that, institute another set of policies, and now they're the fastest growing economy in South America. That encouraged others to do likewise. Of course, Brazil, very early on, rejected those policies, where Lula is now the president. What happened was then people elected governments that promised to oppose IMF policies, oppose Washington Consensus policies. And in my opinion, this notion that there's this kind of left tide is perhaps not the most useful way to describe what's happening. I think it's governments that are opposed to Washington Consensus policies who are beginning to work out what they want to be. all of these economies are sufficiently weak that they need to unite. And they're beginning to see this in order to move forward, and we're seeing some movement in that direction as well. The old Bolivar vision of a united South America is finding some resonance today.
And so, there are some echoes of a populism of an earlier time, but the governments don't really resemble that earlier era. What are some of the differences in terms of just the relationship between the government and the people?
Well, in a country like Bolivia, where we just were, that government came out of a mass popular movement that drove the prior president, who had embraced IMF policies, drove him out of office. There was a series of popular uprisings, first against the privatization of water in the year 2000, later against the imposition of an income tax that would have really hurt poor people a lot more than they were already being hurt, and the privatization of gas. There was this whole series of things, and the country became ungovernable. A political party formed out of that mass movement, and that's where Evo Morales, the president comes from. Other countries, such as say, Ecuador, with President Correa, that Ecuador was again a reaction to IMF policies, but he didn't really come out of a mass movement. He actually went to school here in the United States as an economist, where Evo Morales is the head of the Coca Growers Union, and still is the head of the Coca Growers Union, and came out of a mass movement. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela came out of the military and initially attempted a coup early on, was put into prison. When he got out of prison, he got right back into politics and was eventually elected. So that's a very different kind of origin. Lula in Brazil came out of the workers' movement. He was a union organizer and a worker. He, again, was elected, but less out of a mass movement. His political party pre-existed him, really. They had had control over certain city governments, like of Sao Paulo, for a time, but he came into office out of a party that had existed for some time. And, of course, the economies of all these countries are very, very different.
Well, we're going to look a little more closely at a place that you've just returned from, Bolivia, but first we're going to take a break. We'll be right back on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking with Professor Dave Ranney about the end of the Washington Consensus. Well, when we left, we were talking a bit more about Bolivia as kind of a case study in some of these economic policies. So, if you would maybe you describe the rise of President Morales and where his movement came from, but they were in the news recently with a dust-up with Washington. Perhaps you could give us a little background on that situation.
Yes, well, actually just a very short time after we left the country, the U.S. ambassador was expelled from Bolivia. The U.S. retaliated by expelling their ambassador to the United States and also pulling all the Peace Corps volunteers out of the country. The background on that is that President Morales has been opposed by a minority of really white citizens. He is Indian, and the country is very divided racially. 60% of the country is Indian. The right wing had imposed a recall election on President Morales. He ran and he got 67% favorable vote, so he's very solidly in. They retaliated with a general strike and some very, very violent activities, sabotaging gas lines and actually the killing of 30 peasants in one of the remote states known as Pando, where they took over the airport and wouldn't let the president in and so forth till he sent troops in. Well, what has become very clear is that the U.S. has been funneling money to these right-wing groups and attempting to destabilize the government.
So is there an economic factor in all of this? I mean, there's a geographic one, certainly. These are lowland groups versus the upland.
Yeah.
And the more prosperous versus less so.
There's two big issues. One is the redistribution of lands. The minority, the right-wing minority, are very large landholders who grow soybeans for export. That's the main crop that they're growing. They have the advantage of having extremely cheap Indian labor. The Indians are pretty much landless. There's a provision in the Constitution of the country, which they're proposing to strengthen with a new Constitution, that allows them to take fallow lands, that is, lands that haven't been used for a long time, by eminent domain. The government proposes to do that. This is being opposed vigorously because it would take away the cheap labor force. If Indians were farming their own land, they wouldn't be available to work as cheap labor. That's one issue. The other issue is that Bolivia has no taxes. The only source of revenue for both state, local, and national government are the revenues from hydrocarbons, largely natural gas and oil. And the distribution of those revenues is at stake in all of this. Evo Morales proposes to give a larger portion of the hydrocarbon revenues to establish programs to fight against poverty, and that would take away revenues from the state governments and some of the municipal governments who have used that money to build up their political organizations and protect what their political power.
Well, if we could just let's juxtapose for a minute sort of Washington consensus principles versus the kinds of things you've just been talking about in Bolivia. I mean, where do they really collide?
Well, for one thing, the priority on programs to fight against poverty, as opposed to producing goods for export, that would be soybeans. Is the big thing, and of course the hydrocarbons, which they do want to export, but they're exporting them largely to Latin America. Food for food security's sake, as opposed to food for export, is a big clash. Doing away with privatization, nationalizing hydrocarbons wasn't totally nationalized, but Evo Morales forced the foreign companies to provide 85% of the revenues from that, as opposed to 54% before, to the government. And that was a big shift. The mines have been nationalized once again. Water was nationalized prior to Evo Morales as a result of that political movement. The Bechtel Corporation was kicked out of the country. So those are all things that really are a direct clash with the Washington Consensus policies.
Well, and that brings us, if we could back out a bit to the sort of regional level. Some of the critics from the region have said, in the face of the current bailout package of the economic crisis, that see, here you are, you're nationalizing your financial system. We had it right the whole time.
And I think, of course, the need for a bailout sort of exposes some of the problems with the Washington Consensus policies of making debt as a commodity. But what they're trying to do is to create regional institutions that would be independent of the IMF, the World Bank, any kind of national or international Washington Consensus organization. So there's really 4 institutions that have been set up. They're very young, they're very fragile. We don't know how they're going to go yet, but there's an effort underway. Bank of the South is one, trying to be its own Latin American Development Bank or its own IMF, with a very different set of policy priorities. There's an organization called ALBA, that stands for the Bolivarian Alternative Free Trade Agreement. it's a trade association, or really a trade protocol, very similar to the pre-WTO GATT, if people know what that is. That's been established. UNISUR, which is an effort to become a South American parliament that's pretty much based on the model of the European Union, and Telesur, which is a satellite television station on the model of Al Jazeera that's competing with CNN and Fox News, who are blasting away 24 hours a day presently, but now have a little competition from Telesur to give a local point of view to the news. So those are really interesting institutions. One thing that happened was that after Bolivia threw out the U.S. ambassador, and with this tremendous upheaval of general strikes and violence going on in Bolivia, UNISUR called an emergency meeting. It was called by Michelle Bachelet in Chile. It was held in Santiago. They passed a declaration that was unanimously signed by everybody, including Colombia, the U.S.'s closest ally, that said, number one, that Evo Morales was correct in throwing out the U.S. ambassador, and number two, that the governments of South America would not tolerate a coup against Evo Morales. That was a very stern warning and kind of an unprecedented statement of unity.
Well, and that speaks to a larger issue. What occasioned this this sort of Latin America that can say no, if you will? There are those who say, in part, it was neglect on the part of North America, that we were preoccupied with other parts of the world, and that gave them political space to really develop an alternative.
I don't think that's true. We've been interfering in government affairs right along. The Bush administration has definitely had its eye on South America, with its funding of opposition groups and CIA activity and even military activity. No, I think what it was is it points up the weakness of the Washington Consensus policies themselves. The IMF is really a shell of its former self. It no longer has the political clout that it once had to be able to say, if you don't do what we say, you won't get any more money. That's not true anymore. They don't have that position at the top of the food chain. Their portfolio has dramatically shrunk in the last 4 years, and they're running an annual deficit of over $400 million. So I think those kind of weaknesses in the Washington Consensus institutions and policies then have emboldened the countries of Latin America to take these dramatic steps. And they have interesting leadership in Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, Correa, Lula, Michelle Bachelet, and Lugo in Paraguay is the most recent person to come into the picture. So, all of those things point to the possibility that South America could take a very different turn.
Well, if you look at some of the problems inherent in the sort of populist approach of an earlier time, how is the new system faring in country by country?
It's kind of difficult to say. It's different in different places.
If we look at an indicator like inflation, which was the...
inflation has been greatly reduced in all the countries. It's somewhat of a problem everywhere, but not nearly to the extent that it was. I think having oil and gas prices high has been very helpful to this whole thing from an economic point of view, and enabling someone like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and Evo Morales in Bolivia to engage in programs that really are helping their own people. That's been very helpful, and it's been helpful to all the other countries as well. All of the countries still have tremendous problems, don't get me wrong, and there's some real difficulties, and these alliances are very fragile at the moment. But to me, it's a hopeful time. I sensed a certain amount of hopefulness. We were in Venezuela 2 years ago as well, and we've been in Peru and Ecuador in the last year. In all those places, you do really have a sense that something really significant is happening there that's quite new. They're not returning to the old import substitution models. They're doing something quite different.
Well, and we're about to have new administration in this country, how would you suggest that administration engage with these governments? And what could we do that we've got just about a minute left, so I'll ask you to be brief. But.
Well, the best thing they could do is actually cooperate in seeing that these things work instead of undermining them. I think our policy, our military policy, as well as our political policy of undermining the effort to undermine the Chavez administration, now an effort to undermine the Morales administration, is counterproductive. I'm not so sure the political candidates, either one of them, understands that, but that would be a very helpful direction to go.
Well, Professor Dave Ranney, we're going to have to leave it there. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,